Nicholas Lacassi, digital tutorial. He'll show you how to do it, so just watch the tutorial.
Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about how to take your Photoshop collages and bring them into After Effects to produce animated results like this. Here are some examples that myself and Jesse made for last week to kind of give you some examples of what's possible. In this one, you're seeing each of the components that we've added in Photoshop animating and appearing and then disappearing, so it creates a seamless loop. And on this one, we have some green screen assets like this man walking through the scene, birds flying, to create sort of an animated vignette. On this one here, you can see some vegetation and people, and some chickens are appearing to show the components. And this one as well starts to get into showing how the components would come in and create the perspective. If you followed the introduction and file setup and you've downloaded the Adobe Creative Cloud and After Effects, you should be able to open up this page. And to bring your Photoshop file in, you can just go to where it's saved. So I have it saved right here, and then you can drag it in to this area right here. You're going to be dragging it into where it says project, and this might take a second to import, but then this menu will pop up. So here it says import kind, and this says footage, but you're going to click this drop down arrow and change it to composition, and it should say editable layer styles, merge layer styles into footage. You can leave it as editable layer styles. You press OK. That'll allow us to be able to go in and edit each of the layers that we set up in Photoshop. It's really important when we're working in Photoshop that we match this layer structure that we worked on yesterday. So we have people in a group, we have materials in a group, we have the base file, we have some effects, and then we have the background. So you might not want to put this sort of sky, you might want to put like grass in the background or something else, but you want to just make sure that you have this same layer set up, so when you're importing into After Effects, things look straightforward. So jumping back into After Effects, you can give a quick rundown of the interface. On the top here, you have your project, where this is where you would import files and other things. Down here is your timeline. Here's your composition. And then here are some effects and presets. Your After Effects might look slightly different than this, but you can go in and click default up here, or go over to here and click window and check things that you might be missing, but talk to your TAs to see if you're missing something. That's what we're talking about today. On the left here, we have our composition, which is denoted by this symbol here, this multicolored symbol here. And then below is our layers and folders. So we can expand this and you can see all the different Photoshop layers that things are tied into. So if we double click on this, it'll open up the Photoshop file as a composition. And right now it's very zoomed in. So in the same way as Photoshop, you can zoom in and out with Alt and scroll wheel. Same thing works here. So you can Alt and scroll wheel to zoom all the way out. And then you can use the space bar and click to pan around. A really helpful thing for zooming and scrolling is that you don't really need to be zoomed all the way in or zoomed all the way out. You can just click this button down here where it says 50% right now, and you can click fit, and that'll align to the view. So if you stretch this, it'll fit to that window. So down here in our timeline, you can see that we have the same layers that were in Photoshop are here as well. But a big difference is if things were grouped together properly in Photoshop, they get grouped here as well. And the equivalent of a group in After Effects is a composition. So I could go in and double click on people, and it would open up a second composition here, and that would just isolate the people on a black background. So as you can see, that's the relationship there. And the same thing for materials and textures. Just the materials and texture layers will be in a separate group, and that'll be really helpful later for us to animate just particular parts of the design and then be able to go back and forth between the two. Another thing that's important to cover in the timeline is After Effects is very similar to Photoshop, where you can change the opacity, you can move objects around, but there's an additional layer of time. So this slider here with this blue, almost looks like a light bulb, could be slid over, and you can see up top. Maybe I should move my head over. I'm gonna grab this, move myself over here. As you can see over here, there's a timestamp that's connected to this placement. So if I drag it over to here, we're now at the 6-second mark, and the numbers next to it relate to frames. So if I zoom in here, you can see if I click over one, that's 1 frame. And we're working in a 30 frame sequence. So if we click over 15 frames is the halfway mark between 2 seconds. Another thing with zooming in and out is that you can also do that on the timeline as well. So you can use this to slide back and forth, or you can hold Alt in the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, or you can drag this in the top to scale. So if I grab this, it'll scale in, and this will scale out to show the whole 10 seconds of our animation. Once you have your timeline in, you're going to want to go and edit the composition. So if you click this button up here and do composition settings, there's a couple things that you should change here. So the first one is the width and the height. So you can click the preset and change this to HD TV 1080. So that will change it to a 1920 by 1080. That's like a standard HD viewing. And then you're also going to want to make sure that this is set to 29 frames, but it should change here. And you want to change the duration to 10 seconds. So this is set to 0 hours, 0 minutes, 10 seconds, 0 frames. Because it's a base 30, so these are 30 frames per second. After scaling the composition, you're going to have to scale things to the new frame. So if you select all of them by holding Shift, and then you grab a corner, and it's going to stretch and distort them all. But once you've grabbed the corner, then you hold the Shift button to snap to the same ratio as the original. And so you can take it and you can scale them all in to the new size. So you want to make sure that you don't scale it too much, because then there'll be a black bar. But now if you zoom in, everything should be aligned. We're going to start adding animated content by opening up the After Effects Entourage folder. The file is very big, so I wouldn't recommend downloading the whole thing outright, because it's about 1 gigabyte. I'm going to be putting this folder on Google Drive, so you can open it up and see which particular ones you're interested in downloading, and just download the ones that you need. If you want to download them all, that'd be fine, but I would definitely consider just looking through the folders and picking what you want. So there's subfolders in this one, similar to the Photoshop Entourage folder, where it's broken down into animals that you can place in, some miscellaneous floating particles and triangulations. We have some nature like clouds, fogs, rain effects, snow, water, and then we have a couple of green screen people that you can add in to animate parts of your design. I'm going to add this person walking across the screen here. So if I go back to After Effects, I can minimize this whole folder by clicking this arrow. And then just to add it in, I can drag this video into the project timeline over here. So it's going to take a second to load, but it'll be placed there. And you can just drag it directly into the timeline. So it's going to most likely put it at the bottom. So similarly to Photoshop layers, you can take the layer and drag it up to the top to reveal it. You can drag and select it to move it around, and you can scale it by holding Shift to keep the ratio the same. So this is the opposite of Photoshop. In this one, you need to hold Shift down to scale proportionally. So to remove this green background, you can go over to here and type in key light. And if you just type in the word key, it'll pop up. And so you can apply effects to different layers. You can add effects to all different layers, similarly to Photoshop, like brightness and contrast. So you do that by clicking Effect Controls here. And so since you're clicking on this and there's this box around it, you can drag and add this on top. So now you can see this popped up here, and we can select the screen color to be removed. So if I click this eyedropper here and I click on the green, it'll remove the background. You can turn off the effects by clicking this FX button, and that'll turn it on and off. So now we've removed the background from this object, and we can place it into its desired location. So I think I was planning on putting this person in between these two people. So we're having like sort of a split, and he's walking in the same direction. So you can scale it down by holding Shift and going here, and then move it over. So now that we've placed this person here, if I press the space bar to play, if I'm selected down here, and it'll start playing. Really helpful thing to look at is this green bar right here. Since After Effects is a animation software, it's going to be a lot heavier and more intensive on your computer than Rhino or Photoshop has been. So you can make things a little bit easier for yourself by clicking on where it says full here and lowering it down to a half or a third. But for now, we'll just do half. And so that will reduce the quality. You can kind of see that the guy got a little blurrier, but it'll be much faster to load. And so up here, we can click this info button, and it'll say it's playing from RAM, and it's not real time because it's going through and making this green bar. But if I pause it and I start again, now that the green bar is there and I press play, it will be playing at real time until it gets to the green bar. So it's like the buffering for like YouTube or something. And so when it gets back to that green, it's going to take a second to load. So any major changes that you make are going to, you're going to have to refresh and reload. So I like to make a couple different changes and then not wait for this to reload every time. And once it gets to the end, it'll do a continuous loop over it. Now you can see he's walking in the seam. Once this person is placed in, we need to match the other non-animated people a bit better. And so a really easy way to do that is to search for the fill effect. So you can search for the word fill, and then we can drag it on top of this layer. And it's automatically going to just put a red filter on it. And so it's not going to match the other ones perfectly since the other are using a halftone. But if we click the eyedropper or click here, and then the eyedropper, we can just select one of these blues and do OK. So, and in Photoshop, we added a 75% opacity. So we can do the same thing here. We can get into the more finer details of the layer by expanding it by clicking this arrow down. This opens up a couple different options for us. If we click effects, that shows the effects that are up here, and the menus will be exactly the same. I prefer to use them up here because it's a larger space. If we click transform, it's going to bring up a couple different things that we can affect. The first being anchor point. So if I move this over, you can see that this dot here, which is the anchor point, stays in the same place while everything moves around it. And this one, if I move the position, everything moves with the anchor point. The scale, I can adjust it like that. And the rotation, it'll adjust around the anchor point. So in the same way as Photoshop, we can create these effects. We can do that in After Effects, but we can add a layer of time to it. So just to show you, we can add these effects over time. So if I bring my cursor to the start, I can say, this is the position I want it to be in the start. So I can click this button to set a keyframe. So that will add a little diamond here. And say if I go over to the 4-second point, and I can either use these to extend, and you can see this line is forming here because that's the direction of travel, or I can just grab this and move it over. So now if I start from the beginning, when I press play, not only will he be walking, but he'll be moving in that place. And so I wouldn't do that because it doesn't look realistic and he's already moving, but we can try to do it for a different layer. So I'm going to undo that really quickly by doing Control Z, and I'm going to lower the opacity to 75% so it better matches the other people. Out of all of these characters, I think this person right here would be nice if he came walking in off the screen. And since it's not an animated file, it's not going to look like he's walking per se, but we can have him like sliding in or moving. We can double click the people layer to open up this file, and I'm pretty sure this is the one that we'll be working with. So we can turn it on and off and see by clicking this eyeball next to it. So if we want to animate him appearing from off the screen, we could drop this arrow down and click transform, or we can use some keyboard shortcuts to get us there a bit faster. So if I have this one selected and I click P, that'll open up position. And similarly, I can use the other ones of S for scale, T for opacity, R for rotation, and U to close them. So if I click P again, I could set this character up to start off the screen and appear on. So if we wanted him to appear walking into the screen, we can then add a keyframe, maybe at the 5-second mark. And I can click this to add a keyframe. Then I can maybe go to the beginning and I can grab him and I can just pull him off the screen. So right now, since we're inside this menu, we don't know exactly where things are. So I'm just going to approximate it and we can go back and look. But if I press play on this, he's going to be gradually walking in. Another thing that we can do to make this a little bit more interesting is we can animate other things in this character. So it might be strange if he's just appearing. We can also animate his opacity. So to do that, if you wanted to open up multiple settings at once, you can hold Shift, and then for opacity, we're going to click T. That'll open up the opacity layer, or we can just have them all open, whatever you prefer. But once you have all of these lines open and multiple layers, it gets really messy, so it's helpful just to have just the ones that you want. But for now, it's fine. So for 5, we can click opacity to have this set as 100%, and then we can bring it over to here and then lower this down to 0. So now not only is the person going to move in, it's also going to appear over time. So you can kind of see if we maybe send this over to here, to see how it like fades in like that. So let's go back to this animation layer and see how that looks. So he appears in and then he shows up and this guy's still walking over here. If this is an observation tower over New York, I'm sure there's going to be some wind moving these balloons. So we can add a slight effect for them to be waving back and forth with the wind. So if we go back over to the people and find the balloon person, we can animate just these separately because you wouldn't want the whole person to move. If I animate this position, the whole person is going to move back and forth. We only want the balloons to do it. So similarly to layer masks in Photoshop, we can do masks in After Effects too. To do that with the layer selected, you can click this button here. It's the pen tool, or the rectangle tool to select out objects. So if I click the pen tool first, and I just click around her, that will cut out the balloons. And you can see down here, it's added a mask as an option of things you can click, while the other ones do not have that. So if I click down on the masks, it'll open up this. And then this is saying that this mask is mask 1. We've cut out the balloon, but we need to add it back on a separate layer. To duplicate layers, if you're clicking on the main file, you can do Control D. That'll create a duplicate with all the effects that you've added onto it. So if I expand this down and I click this mask, now there's 2 masks here. But for this layer, I can change this from add to subtract. So now on this layer, it's just the balloon, and this layer is just the person. Now they're separate from each other, and we can edit them as such. So if I want to animate this balloon swaying in the wind, it's going to be rotating from this center point. So we can set that up by clicking on this one, which is the balloon that's isolated, and then expand the transform and edit rotation. So at the start, we can click this button to affect rotation. And let's start maybe 1 second in, and then we can rotate it. But there's a problem because it's rotating around this axis. So we're going to have to move that axis to her hand. So you can move the anchor point by selecting this tool up here, which is the pan behind. And so now if I click on this, I can drag it, and you can see in the bottom left how it's affecting both the anchor point and the position. So now we can place it right there. And now if we do rotation, it's going to be aligned to that center point. So we can make that animation really subtle. We can say maybe it's going over 6 degrees, and then we can go over to the 2 second mark, and then we can say, oh, it was -6. So we can just make this +6 degrees. So now if we press play on that, it's going back and forth like that. And it seems a little bit too fast. So we can just pull these out. Maybe I'll make this at 3 seconds, and I'll make this at 1.5 seconds. Let's see how that looks. It's still a little bit too fast. You can continue to work with it to stretch it out. Maybe I'll just bring this over to here and see how that looks. Yeah, I think that looks really good. You can copy and paste keyframes instead of having to go back and change them. I can click this and do Control C, and I can bring this over to maybe the 8 second mark or the 9 second mark, and I can click Control V. And it's a really nice thing to do is at the end of all your animations, try to return back to center. It's not totally necessary, but it helps, so that if I press play through this, it's going to rock back and forth, and then continue to rock back and forth, and at the end of the 10 seconds, it'll return back to the start, so that when it continues back from the center, it looks like it's one continuous loop. So back on here, you can kind of see it's rocking back and forth, and it's a really nice, maybe more subtle effect to kind of add to the overall composition. Okay, so let's continue to add more green screen effects. We could add additional clouds to the background to make it look like it's moving. To do that, let's go over to our green screen folder and click Nature, and then we can select one of these cloud files. I think I'm going to want to try this one, and then I'm going to go back to the project and drag this in. And so once that loads, we can bring it into the design. So we have a sky layer here, which we can turn on and off. So we would want to put this file directly in front of that. So let's just place it, and we can drag and place it right there so it's in front. And so you can see it's behind everything else right now. And we can just turn everything off by holding down and selecting, and we can align this to the view. But let's press play on this and see how it looks. We have a couple clouds moving in and out. I think we should be able to just scale this up and do the key light effect to put it in place. Let's slide this over a bit. For some reason, this came in at the 15 frame mark. So we can just grab this and pull it over. And then we can expand this arrow down and then click transform, and we can scale this up. So we can bring it up to here. Really helpful to see what's behind by lowering the opacity for now. And we can continue to move it over and try to align it to the composition a bit better. So I'm going to continue to scale. So then we'll go back to the key light effect and drag it on top of it. So as you can see here, you can apply it directly to the composition by dragging it on top, and then these arrows will appear over which composition you're applying it to. And so that'll pop up this, and we could, if we just use this and click here, it's not going to get rid of it perfectly. So it's better to increase the opacity so you have solid, and then use this on an area so it looks a bit better. So right now this is kind of cutting into the ground. So let's move it up a bit more, and then we can add a mask to it so it's not such a hard line. So to do that, we can use the rectangle tool instead of the pen tool this time, and we can drag and select. And so right now it's just on add. As you can see down here, it says add. We can change that to subtract, that'll delete it. So let's just add to there roughly where the horizon is, and we can do subtract. And so it's still a hard line. If I get out of this, you can see it's there, but we can feather that line by expanding the mask and then stretching this mask feather. So as you can see now, click out, it's a lot better now that there's a 92 pixel feather. We've gotten a bit far into this tutorial, but I need to bring up saving. As you can see in the top here, this is an untitled project. I have not saved yet. So let's go and save now before we lose the work that we've done so far. It's really important. I sometimes forget as well and lose a lot of work. So I'm going to save this as today's date, animation tutorial. Sorry about that. I'll make sure to emphasize this when we're talking in person. I spelled animation wrong. And make sure to save often with Control S. It's really, really essential that you don't lose your work and you save often. So if we press play on this, you can see the clouds moving in the background, and it's not extremely realistic, but it just adds a level of complexity to your overall animation. And what we can do is lower the opacity to say 75%. So it's a little bit lighter and you can see the clouds coming from behind. And then we can go back and turn these back on. We pause first. We can turn the other layers back on. So you're seeing like the clouds moving in the background, this person walking, these balloons moving, and this person has appeared and walked in. So maybe we can try to add 1 or 2 more animations, and then we should be set with this one. If you wanted to mirror this walking person, you can right click on them and go to transform, and then you can edit some different things here. You can flip horizontal to move it over, and it's going to flip around this mirror point, so you might have to move it over. But for this view, I'm probably going to keep it in the same place. So I've added this flock of birds flying in the background to give the image a little bit more depth. And once you're happy with all of your components that you've added, you can add a little intro and an outro to make it loop better and kind of introduce all of your materials appearing. To do that, you can animate the opacity on various layers so that they appear and disappear at the beginning and the end. Select one layer. Let's start with just the people and do T to open up opacity, or we can expand this down and open up opacity here, but I prefer to use the shortcut. So T, and then starting at maybe at the 1 second mark, we can click this clock to set there, and then going back to 0, we can lower this down to 0 opacity. So if we press play on that, over 1 second, the people will appear, and let's replay it at full speed. So 1 second is a little bit slow. I like to make things either 15 frames or 20 frames for appearing animations. So I can zoom in, and then I can grab this, and I can move it to the 20-second mark. And then I'm also going to copy that over to this walking person. Since they're on a separate layer, they're not disappearing in the same way. So if I click T on that person, I can copy and paste the same keyframes by dragging and selecting, and do Control C. And then if I click on this one, wherever my cursor is, if I press Control V, it's going to place it at that location. So if I undo that and put my cursor here and I do Control V, it'll place in the same place. So now those will appear at the same time. So I think what I'll do is I'll add that same opacity at different times. So the people can come in first, then the materials, then the sky. And we can just do that relatively easy by copying, opening up T, and then say placing it here. So now the people come in first, then the materiality, and then maybe we'll have the sky come in and the birds and stuff. So let's go over to here and let's click T, and we'll paste it on this layer. And then let's also paste it on these two layers as well. So since they're both selected, I can click Control V and it'll paste it on both of them. So now if we look through this, it's going to start just with lines, and then the materials and the people appear, and then the background and the birds appear in the back. It also looks like since we copied and pasted where it was set to 75, the background didn't come in fully solid, so we can easily edit that by hovering the cursor over the location. So see how it's there? And then we can take this opacity and bring it up to 100. It's really important that the cursor is on top of it, because you can add a second keyframe next to it. Say if I zoom all the way out here, it almost looks like it's on it, but if I make any adjustments here, it'll add a second keyframe. So we definitely wouldn't want that. So I'm just going to click delete on that. So it's starting with just the line work, and then the three categories of materials appear. And then at the end, we're just going to add a fade out. Going back and looking at this recording and editing it, I realized my head is blocking this whole sequence. So all I did was add another keyframe here by clicking these points. This point will add a keyframe at a moment, and then I drag them all to 0. So it fades out. So now once we play the ending, the animation continues, and then it fades back to the lines. So I might just shift these things over slightly, because as we play it again, it's only lines for like a second, and I don't think that's enough. So let's just bring this over to the half-second mark. So we have like a half of a second where the animation is just lines at the end. Great. Now that our design is complete, let's go through the exporting process. So you're going to go up to File, and you're going to click Export, and you're going to say Add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue. And so it's going to add whichever one you're working in. So right now we're in the right animation, so you click Add. After it loads, it should open up this menu. So you're going to click here. It might not say animated GIF here. That was just what I was working on last, just this first drop-down menu. And that'll open up a separate box. So on the top where it says Format, you're going to click H264, and that'll change it to an MP4. And then when you click Output Name and place that where you've been working, so I'm just going to leave that there and click Save. And everything else is fine. You don't need to change anything else. Since we didn't add any audio to this, we can uncheck audio and it'll export a bit faster. And everything else is good. You press OK. And then those things will update here. And then you can press this green triangle to play. So we'll check back in when this is done, and we can play the final result. After loading, you can open up to see if it works. This might be an iterative process. You might go through and realize one of your characters is moving incorrectly, or one of your layers is too light. So don't worry about it if you have to go back and do this multiple times. We're going to be uploading our clips to YouTube so that we can embed them into Conceptboard. After you make one, you can click this button here to click Create. You can go to Upload Video, and you can just drag the file into it. You can drag it there. You should name it CEA Digital Design - Lacazzi Assignment 3. and you can select your thumbnail, and down here you could say no, it's not made for kids, and click next, and next again, and you can make that either unlisted or public, but for me I'm just gonna make it public, and I'll click publish, and so it's gonna be published to this link. We can click on it and view it on YouTube. We can click share and copy that link, and you can go to your concept board, which should be here, and then you would replace whichever one in your column. So you have to click this to edit, and you click this plus bar on the top and embed audio/video, and you paste that link here with Control V, and you click embed, and there you go. So just rescale it to fit the column width, and replace the one that's already there. If you click this top bar, it brings up the menu to change the scale, and you can stretch it so there's no black bars. So if you first align it to the column, which is aligned to these light white lines, then you can adjust this size so that it matches the 16:9 ratio.